Iran wanted to send a message. If the US was going to station an aircraft carrier in the waters near Iran, then it would send a drone to show that the carrier could be hit. This was supposed to be Iranian power, a showcase of strength that would convince the US that it needs to stay away. But the US responded to Iran's jab with a haymaker. A US F-35 just sent Iran a deadly message in the Arabian Sea as tensions rise and a powder keg looks set to explode. It all started in mid-January. As protests erupted in the streets of Iran, the US sent warnings not to shut them down, and Iran did it anyway. By January 15th, the US had responded by sending a US Navy supercarrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, in the direction of the Middle East. The carrier went on its way, flanked by its strike group. Heading from the South China Sea, where it had been conducting live fire exercises, the USS Abraham Lincoln moved toward Iran and eventually reached the Arabian Sea. Iran watched all of this unfold, and it had something planned for the USS Abraham Lincoln's arrival. The US would have an impressive answer to that plan, as we'll get to in a minute. But as for Iran's big move, it was made on February 3. Unhappy about the presence of the US carrier in such close proximity, Iran sent a single drone that the US reports aggressively approached the carrier. It's unknown if that drone was intended to strike if it got close enough. We don't even know if the drone was equipped with a warhead capable of doing much damage. But the drone had unclear intent, Reuters reports, and it had to be dealt with. Right now, there's some confusion about what type of drone Iran sent. According to Reuters, it was a Shahed 139, which is among the most modern long-range strike drones that Iran has in its arsenal. Not a lot is known about this drone. Defense and Security Monitor says that it is believed to be an upgraded version of the Shahed 129, which it says has a range of 2,000 kilometers, or about 1,242 miles, and an operating endurance of 24 hours, enabling long-distance flight. Presumably, the Shahed 139 can fly further and longer, and may also be capable of carrying a larger warhead. It is believed to have entered service in 2024, making it conceivable that it was the type of drone that Iran sent. However, other sources claim that it wasn't a Shahed 139. What Iran actually sent may have actually been a Shahed 129. Tasnim News said as much in an X post. That same outlet claimed that there was nothing suspicious about the Shahed 129 doing what it was doing. In an interview with Tasnim, an informed source said about a British media report that an American plane targeted an Iranian drone over the Abraham Lincoln. The Shahed 129 drone was conducting its usual and legal mission in open waters, conducting reconnaissance, surveillance, and taking pictures, and this is considered a routine and legal action, the outlet claimed. Sure, every country sends drones into open waters that just so happen to approach aircraft carriers erratically. Assuming it was indeed a Shahed 129 that Iran sent in the USS Abraham Lincoln's direction, then it could have been on a strike mission. As Odin reports, the Shahed 129 has two twin hardpoints that enable it to carry 4 munitions, which combine to give the drone a potential payload of 400 kilograms, or 881 pounds. This is no insignificant amount of firepower, assuming the drone that Iran sent was fully loaded. The U.S. had to take it seriously, and what it did to stop the Shahed drone could have ramifications that affect the entire Middle East. We'll get to what those ramifications are a little later. First, you need to know what the U.S. actually did and learn about another little trick that Iran tried to pull on the same day that it deployed its drone. As the Iranian Shahed approached the American carrier, it was being tracked all the way. Warnings were sent. They weren't heeded. So, the U.S. decided to fight fire with fire, or, more accurately, it chose to fight an ember with a blazing inferno. If Iran was going to send a drone as a threat to the U.S., then America would respond to that threat with one of its most powerful aerial platforms, the F-35. As the War Zone, or TDUZ, reports, the U.S. unleashed an F-35C Joint Strike Fighter on Iran's drone. The fighter jet easily handled the drone, shooting it down in an instant, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, given the complete mismatch in firepower on display. After all, stuff like this is the finest 35 degrees Celsius's bread and butter. As Max Afterburner explains in his YouTube video covering the American response, the F-35 degrees Celsius is the carrier version of the typical Joint Strike Fighter, and it is built for stealthy strikes and ensuring that the U.S. maintains air superiority. F-35Cs are made to operate in contested zones, and their top speed of about Mach 1.6 means they can fly circles around something as comparatively simplistic as a Shahed drone. Iran's drone never stood a chance. U.S. Navy Captain Tim Hawkins, who is the spokesperson for U.S. Central Command, explains what happened next. Or, at least, he explains what the U.S. is willing to reveal about what it did to Iran's Shahed. An F-35C fighter jet from Abraham Lincoln shot down the Iranian drone in self-defense and to protect the aircraft carrier and personnel on board. No American service members were harmed during the incident, and no U.S. equipment was damaged, Hawkins reported after the incident. He also revealed just how far Iran's drone must have traveled as part of its supposedly routine and legal mission. USS Abraham Lincoln CVN-72 was transiting the Arabian Sea approximately 500 miles from Iran's southern coast when an Iranian Shahed 139 drone unnecessarily maneuvered toward the ship, Hawkins added, which immediately makes the Tasnim news report look more than a little bit silly. Sure, you could argue that using drones in your territorial waters is legal and routine, but using them 500 miles from the Iranian coast when the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea says that countries generally control the waters up to about 12 nautical miles from their coastlines. The claim that Iran's Shahed was operating routinely and legally starts to look a little rich in that context. Even if you take exclusive economic zones into account, Iran could only feasibly claim to control 200 miles beyond its coastlines before its drones hit international waters. This wasn't a legal move by Iran, and the U.S. let Iran know about it. But what we don't know, at least not yet, is precisely what America's F-35C used to destroy the Iranian Shahed. Frankly, the fighter jet has a glut of options to choose from. TWZ lists the most likely candidates. The F-35C could have used AIM 9x Sidewinder missiles. That would be one of the cheaper options, Max Afterburner says, though not by much. At about $900,000 per unit, the U.S. could have saved itself about $100,000, compared to using another of the F-35C's options, the AIM-120 Advanced Medium-Range Air-to-Air Missile. At a cool $1 million per unit, these are some of the best air-to-air missiles available anywhere in the world. Either option would be more than enough to take out a single Shahed drone. However, using them would be overkill to a massive degree. But then, perhaps that was the point. Sending an F-35C to a drone fight is the equivalent of having a UFC fighter square off against a toddler. There's only going to be one winner, and it's not going to be little Timmy. Using either of these missiles against Iran's Shahed drone would be like hitting that poor little guy with a Superman punch when his back is turned. It's just not a fair fight. Perhaps a more likely candidate for what the F-35C's pilot used against Iran's Shahed was the aircraft's 25mm gun pod, which has 4 barrels and can rattle off a maximum of 181 rounds, according to Key. Arrow. The F-35C also has a missionized gun system, which can fire up to 220 rounds. Either could have destroyed Iran's Shahed with a quick burst. Frankly, it almost doesn't matter what weapon was used. The mere fact that an F-35C was deployed is a show of force that Iran couldn't have been expecting. After all, the U.S. has dealt with Iranian drones before, only not with quite so much firepower. Back in 2019, TWZ reported that the U.S. had deployed Marine anti-drone buggies to take down an Iranian drone that had approached the Wasp-class amphibious assault ship, the USS Boxer. The drone got to within a threatening range and was then taken out. So, perhaps the message that the U.S. sent on February 3rd was as much about revealing that it has more than enough options for dealing with Shaheds as it was about hitting as hard as it possibly could against Iran's little threat. Max Afterburner makes that point, noting that the F-35C is a good choice for dealing with a single threat while sending a message. But if Iran had gotten overconfident, perhaps by sending an entire drone swarm, the U.S. might have taken a different approach. The USS Abraham Lincoln could have sent an EA-18G Growler into the fight, as that airframe is equipped with electronic warfare systems that can send Shaheds veering far off course. The Growler is actually a tweaked version of the FA-18, Afterburner says, so it's not like the jet is helpless without its electronic warfare equipment. Ultimately, what we've just seen Iran try to do is test the U.S. Iran tweaked the American nose, and it learned precisely what will happen if it does something so stupid. And it already looks like Iran is trying to calm things down, as you'll learn if you keep on watching for our analysis of the aftermath of this event. But before we dig into that, Iran's Shahed utterly failing to present any sort of threat to the US wasn't the only story to come out of February 3. On the very same day, Iran tried to project its power in the Strait of Hormuz, and it's fair to say that the projection fell flat on its face. According to Bloomberg, Iran made the strange decision to send a handful of small armed ships into the Strait of Hormuz, where they proceeded to hail an oil tanker that is part of a U.S. military fuel procurement program. The ships were crewed by members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they reportedly harassed the U.S. vessel, named the Stena Imperative, with threats that they were going to board and seize the tanker. That little escapade didn't go over particularly well. The U.S. deployed a guided missile destroyer to the location of the incident, yet again sending a message to Iran. The Revolutionary Guard can have their small gunships, but they're not going to do much when faced by a true American warship. Max Afterburner offers a funny assessment of the whole situation. He points out that the Iranian vessels were equipped with 50 caliber machine guns and small reconnaissance drones when they attempted to board the Stena Imperative. The only reason that the fast boats and the drone didn't get to the oil tanker to board it was because a U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke-class destroyer stepped in as the bodyguard and shooed them away. Very kindly, Afterburner says, adding, "I'm sure they were basically like, hey, go ahead and step this way, Iranian fast boats, or you're going to meet with our friends," a 30mm gun. As with the F-35C and the Shahed, there would only have been one winner in this fight. For the record, Iran once again claimed that it was doing nothing more than monitoring its territorial waters, and that the U.S. tanker failed to provide the appropriate legal documents for transit through the Strait of Hormuz. That seems unlikely. What is far more likely is that Iran was once again trying to send a message to the U.S., with that message being that it could turn the Strait of Hormuz into a choke point, if it wants to. Whether Iran could actually do that is irrelevant. The threat that it could pose is enough, as the Strait of Hormuz is a very important passageway. It enables ships to enter and exit the Persian Gulf safely, making it a major waterway. As the U.S. Energy Information Administration pointed out in June 2025, around 20 million barrels of crude oil, crude condensate, and petroleum products pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That amounts to about 20% of the entire world's global petroleum liquid consumption, the administration says. The BBC adds that Iran technically has some control over which ships pass through the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the strait and its shipping lanes are entirely within Iran and Oman's territorial waters. Should Iran choose to block the strait, it could potentially do so using submarines and fast attack boats, like the one that harried the U.S. tanker. Those boats wouldn't form a blockade, but they could lay mines to make it clear to any vessel that braves the strait that there is a lot of risk involved. What we saw on February 3 was a hint from Iran that it could cause a lot of trouble in the Strait of Hormuz. Whether it would actually do that depends on how much it is worried about the almost inevitable U.S. response that would come after. And that brings us nicely back to what is going to happen next after Iran's two aggressive incidents against American vessels. Are we going to see the USS Abraham Lincoln and its carrier strike group go on the attack? Are American fighter jets going to bombard Iranian military sites with missiles and bombs, as they did during Operation Midnight Hammer in the summer of 2025? The answer seems to be no, at least, not yet. In the wake of this pair of incidents, the U.S. seems to have decided to continue trying to take a diplomatic route with Iran, rather than responding with more force than may be necessary. Speaking to Fox News, the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, confirmed what had happened with the USS Abraham Lincoln, but noted that President Donald Trump is committed to pursuing diplomacy, and that his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, will still be traveling to a meeting with Iranian delegates on February 7th. Leavitt did say that Trump, as always, is leaving his options open. As of right now, Witkoff is set to have conversations with the Iranians later this week, claims Leavitt, before adding, "Those are still scheduled as of right now, but of course the president has always a range of options on the table, and that includes the use of military force. The Iranians know that better than anyone. Iran also seems wary about the impending meeting collapsing. However, it has also been trying to project power related to them. As The Guardian reports, the discussion between Witkoff and Iran's delegates was originally supposed to take place in Turkey. However, Iran later demanded that they take place in Oman, and that they happen without the presence of a group of Arab states that are presumably going to serve some sort of mediation role. The U.S. initially rejected this request, which placed the meeting in jeopardy. However, a last-ditch effort by the Arab states in question appears to have convinced the White House to change its course. For those states, these talks are essential because they will cover Iran's nuclear program and could end up being a key step toward an agreement being formed that enables the regulation of said program. We'll have to see what happens on February 7 to learn if the U.S. making this concession was worth it. As for what Iran did on February 3, Max Afterburner says that these attacks are right out of Iran's playbook in terms of offering plausible deniability. Not in the sense that Iran will claim it had nothing to do with what happened. It obviously did, and it has said as much with its various claims about protecting its waters. Even though some of those claims are shaky, the deniability comes from the scale of the attacks. Iran sent one drone to the USS Abraham Lincoln rather than a swarm. It backed off when the U.S. warship arrived to guide the Stena Imperative through the Strait of Hormuz. All of this is a flex, not Iran preparing for a fight. Still, Iran has a problem that it hasn't yet solved. Its response to the protests we mentioned right at the start of this video could still cause issues. Trump had already warned Iran that the U.S. would take action if Iran cracked down on the protests to the point of executing its own citizens. The U.S. president has also claimed that Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, should be very worried about what might lie in store for his country if an agreement isn't reached during the upcoming meeting between Witkoff and the Iranian delegates. On the protest front, Iran's regime certainly doesn't seem to have heeded Trump's warning. As Amnesty International says, thousands of protesters have been arrested, and there are now concerns about them being tortured and otherwise assaulted while they're in captivity. There have also been claims that at least 30,000 people died during the protests, and that bodies were disappearing while others were being buried in mass graves. Will all of this come up during the nuclear talks? Possibly, though it currently seems that the U.S. is more concerned about getting those talks over the line than it is about following through on its past threats. Iran's regime may have tried its luck on February 3rd because it has grown bullish in the wake of the lack of a U.S. response related to its crackdown on the protests. Just 2 days before the drone and fast boat incidents, Khamenei himself warned that any attack on his country would spark a regional war that could quickly spiral out of control. The Americans should know that if they start a war, this time it will be a regional war, Iran's supreme leader said, though, as with anything that comes out of Khamenei's mouth, it's difficult to tell what is posturing and what is real. The same could be said for Trump, in some respects, as both sides seem to now be engaged in a dangerous form of negotiation in which they're using very real weapons to get what they want out of a nuclear program deal. The one thing that Iran knows for sure is that the U.S. can and has hit hard in the very recent past. Testing boundaries is one thing. Iran is lucky that the U.S. is still pursuing diplomatic solutions on the nuclear front. However, if things go south during the meeting on February 7th, we may be looking at what happened 4 days before as warning shots being delivered by both sides. And if they were, America's shots were much stronger, and Iran's regime would have received the deadly message they delivered loud and clear. As for the U.S., it's been busy on several fronts over the past week. At around the same time that it was dealing with Iran's aggression, the U.S. announced the successful live-fire testing of a weapon that could be a game-changer in the Ukraine war. Find out what that weapon is and why it matters so much in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the developing situation between the U.S. and Iran's regime